For me, it's acknowledging the many, many people who've been involved over that 30 years. And that's something quite extraordinary, isn't it? That's worth celebrating.
You have to cast yourself back to the 1990s here in the UK, and there was no National Museum for Modern or Contemporary Art, and certainly no contemporary art being presented in historic houses.
When I first came to Harewood in the mid-1980s, it was obviously a really different place to what we see today. The house had actually become quite run down. A lot of the rooms were in quite a state of disrepair. What happened was my father-in-law, the 7th Earl, actually undertook this major restoration project. Although working in the contemporary arts of my life, I'm a great fan of Turner and Girting and the English watercolourists, so it was a great thrill in the earliest days to see those collections here.
The Lassells family have always commissioned and supported great living artists. So right from the start, of course, they commissioned Chippendale to create this beautiful furniture in the house. Edward Lassells, Beau Lassells as he was known in the late 1700s, was very much part of the Prince of Wales fashionable set, and he collected beautiful collections of ceramics and porcelain. And through to the 1960s, one of the really interesting pieces you first see when you walk through the doors is Epstein's Adam. This huge alabaster sculpture of Adam in the front hall, in amongst all these 18th century beautiful interiors.
When Epstein first made that piece, his dealers were frightened of it. He made it in the late 30s. And to have that, as the starting point in this historic setting, I think is an incredibly bold and powerful statement, and sets the mood, if you like, for contemporary art at Harewood.
My father-in-law was a major figure in the arts, but he was also quite a keen art collector. So when this idea came up of creating a contemporary space actually in the house, he was very supportive of it. And the space that we worked with is what was the sub-hall, which opens onto the south side of the house, onto the terrace. The unusual thing, I suppose, that we went on to do was then panel out this whole space to create a very contemporary space, which was in complement and contrast to the rest of the house and the historic collections.
This is one of those comings together that happens to cities. Leeds, recovering from the war, had the bonus of the Gregory Fellowships. Peter Gregory endowed the university with money to get emerging artists, have them on the campus. It was a tremendous excitement. I'm talking about that from 1950 right through to 1968. And like all these things, it had its day and went. And where you come in is, after all the excitement had died, and I suddenly began to get to know you and to realize that you, because you're an artist first, you happen to have negotiating skills as well, which is a good bonus, but you're an artist first. And therefore you were always interested in contemporary arts. And I can only think at that time, my own little puny efforts to keep things going. But the other, of course, was Peter Murray. I have huge admiration for him, but I have for you too, because you had to break a lot of molds. I imagine it wouldn't have been easy to have, I won't say taken Harewood by the scruff of the neck, but to have introduced something knew, like the creation of the Terrace Gallery, there'd be certain conservative elements. As I say, it never has been done, but you did, you persisted, and devoted it to contemporary art.
It's only sort of more recently I've really thought that was a pretty strange thing to do. Oh, hello, I've just arrived. What about a contemporary art gallery in your very grand house? But presumably, many years before the Terrace Gallery was even thought of, people were thinking the same about you. I mean, creating a sculpture park.
So when we started, no one was interested. In fact, there was a huge amount of opposition. What they described as rusty bits of metal in the 18th century landscape. There was very little interest in contemporary art in this part of the world. It took a long time for people to understand the implications of what we were doing, not just in terms of the influence on other projects and developments, but the influence in terms of education. And I think Terrace Gallery had a similar development. Why would you want to impose, if you like, a contemporary art space in a historic home? But then I think art is to do with that. It's to do with taking on spaces. It's to do with challenging things visually.
The Terrace Gallery opened in 1989, and that exhibition was called Images of Paradise and involved over 60 artists. So it was at that time an issue of profound importance, which was global climate change and deforestation. And this is now of critical importance. And as I speak here today, forest fires are raging throughout the Amazon.
Part of the reason for the extraordinary nature of this was in Diane, you not only had somebody who is a talented and sophisticated curator, but also a practitioner in her own right and a practitioner of considerable note. I think there is an emotional truth, an emotional resonance to everything that has been programmed in the Terrace Gallery. And what the Terrace Gallery and Diane have done is set the bar really high. She has made us think outside of the box in terms of bringing in other art forms in the exposition of the visual arts.
There were works of art that also made their way into the house, and that was very exciting. The family collection has many great mid-century or early 20th century modern masterpieces. So modernity is present there. The programme of the Terrace Gallery that then started to find its way into different spaces. We then saw a wonderful contrast between 18th century artefacts and paintings and 20th and 21st century practice.
In 1991, I got a phone call from Diane, and she said she'd like to meet because she was programming a number of South Asian artists in the Terrace Gallery, and they were Arpana Kaur, Tara Sabarwal, and Shafiquddin. It helped us develop a long-term relationship with Arpana Kaur, a relationship that continues to this day. And I acquired a number of her works for public collections, notably Bradford museums and galleries.
One of the exhibitions that was really wonderful was Desert Dreaming in 1992. It showed work by 37 native Australian artists. It's really very extraordinary and very powerful work and very different to the European eye. And it juxtaposed the early Aranda watercolour tradition paintings alongside the then more recent Western Desert acrylic paintings.
One of the exhibitions memorable to me and meaningful to me was the one when you agreed to show my African collection at Harewood, because I'd had this ambition to get together an exhibition of African art and just slay everybody with the magnificence. But although I wooed the British Museum, they always wanted it in controlled circumstances. You need to walk around it, it's conceptual, it's rounded, and you were instrumental in letting that exhibition come. It looked beautiful.
It was a very beautiful exhibition. This was an exhibition called Truth and Beauty in 2007.
Was it? As far back as that, yeah.
We have, over time, focused on different aspects of Harewood's history, and notably in 2007 there was a nationwide commemoration of the abolition of the slave trade. We felt very strongly that this was an opportunity to fully and positively engage with Harewood's history and the original building of Harewood House, which had been funded by money from interests in the West Indies, and of course through that, the slave trade. So we had many layers of different activities across the whole year, a great many educational workshops. We had exhibitions throughout the whole season. We had music events. Most notably, we had a production of Carnival Messiah, which was a major theatrical production created and directed by the inspirational Geraldine Connor. In terms of the contemporary visual arts, we had a major exhibition by Sonia Boyce, and we had a major exhibition by sculptor Sukari Douglas Camp. So this is the old wall garden. This has always been one of my favourite places. You open this door into this space, which is like an outdoor room. So it's completely walled and you are completely contained. Prior to creating Spiral Meadow in 1999, it had been closed and basically abandoned for many years. So we created Spiral Meadow as a way of opening the space again. Meadows are very beautiful and nowadays are quite rare. Since the Second World War, the vast majority of traditional meadows have been lost. So we cut out a huge spiral in the turf and planted the bed that we cut out with 31 varieties of different meadow flowers and grasses.
As a curator, I've spent much of my career presenting art in white cubes. So it was incredibly exciting when in 2013 I was offered the opportunity to curate an exhibition at Harewood House. I co-curated the exhibition with Diane Howse, and we discovered, of course, that there are an incredible treasure trove, not only of great oil paintings, but also works on paper. The inspiration for the title of our exhibition, In Cloud Country, came from a poem by the American poet Sylvia Plath. We were drawn to that title because when we thought about the main difference between modern and historic art was the rise of abstraction. And we were able to include some very, very contemporary painters like Chris O'Feely, Gary Hume, Georgie Hopton. And it was for the artists very exciting to come to this great 18th century house and see their work in dialogue with a Constable returner with these great masterpieces.
It's much easier in some respects to take, a white cube and put art in it. I mean, if you're actually taking a historic landscape like the Breton landscape, but in particular the Capability Brown landscape of Harewood, you've really got to think much more carefully, because you are, to a certain extent, either interfering with that or you're helping it evolve.
One of the most extraordinary pieces that we made here was a work by artist Kate Whiteford, who created this huge land drawing on Greystone Hill. And it was a figure that was derived from her looking at ideas of the serpentine line and the lines within the Chippendale furniture in the house. And it appeared as this enormous chalk hill drawing in the traditional sense. But in fact, it was made out of a very special, breathable canvas fabric that was actually pegged to the ground. With something like Spiral Meadow and Kate Whiteford's land drawing and other works that have been situated in the landscape, a piece by Kate Davis called Eve, which was a tree wrapped in gold down by the edge of the lake. So over time, quite a number of works have been actually in the landscape, as well as people choosing to make the landscape a subject that they were working with.
So Seeds of Hope was a project that was commissioned by Harewood, done in collaboration with Lord Whitney. It was the 100 years of the end of World War I, so it was a bit of a celebration of the end, but also really looking at the role that the gardens played in helping win the World War. Part of the garden was very much based on production, so very much about what produce would have been grown, but then also created a sunflower installation, which was over 1,200 sunflowers that were potted into sandbags to sort of represent the trenches. And that also represented each of the soldiers that were recovering at Harewood at the time when it became an auxiliary hospital.
One of the benefits of showing contemporary work in a historic setting is that we see voices and bodies that have been invisible in the past. The contemporary programme gives an opportunity to, in a way, fill in these great missing gaps in history and in historical representation.
It's brought artists from all over the world to Yorkshire, and it has also showcased artists of international repute in this country and beyond to Yorkshire. So people like Anthony Gormley and Sonia Boyce, Zarina Binji, and these are artists based in this country.
It's been really interesting to also learn about how bold and brave it was of Diane to set up the contemporary arts programme. It's just really great to see 30 years later that that's something that's continuing and growing, and it feels like it's also pushing a lot of boundaries, and hopefully we'll get to be a part of that in the future.
I think for new generations, particularly for young people, to be able to shape their own destiny, they need to have that confidence. They need to have access to their imagination, to a sense of entrepreneurship, and an ability and confidence to make stuff and to shape a different future. So for me, the arts and creativity are fundamental to that. And they have to be part of our education. They have to be part of our experience of everyday life.
Sculpture Park has been going for 43 years and Harewood Contemporary has been going for 30 years, and we hope both will continue for many more years to come. But there's a way in which, particularly kind of in the world we're in right at this moment, that the arts seem even more important than ever, and that people can have access to art.
When we started here in 1977, there was a real structure, particularly in West Yorkshire, for art education. The changes in education, which I deplore personally, have actually had a really negative impact in the public sector. And so therefore, what you're doing at Harewood and what we're doing here is even more important, is even more relevant today, because it does give children and students an opportunity to be able to see real art, to be able to come into contact with artists.
I think contemporary art is increasingly relevant. Artists are, powerful critiquers of the contemporary world. This is a cliche, but they do hold a mirror up to society. A lot of schools and young people go to Harewood. So these groups of young people are given access where they can make their own connections, because I think it is so important. And above all, it helps develop a kind of visual literacy that perhaps is not given that much attention to.
Harewood is an educational charitable trust, and by that I mean education in its widest sense, whether it is sitting in a classroom or rolling up your sleeves here to take part in workshops, or running round and being inspired by what you see. We've come to a really interesting juncture where arts and creativity was very much invested in all the way through 2000 and onwards, and we've seen the results of that with these great creative artists, great creative industries being some of the biggest industries this country is now creating and celebrating. But we've got a danger that that will diminish because we're not investing in arts education, and we feel here we can start to make up for that. So that's why we're doing the Harewood Biennial, that's why we are continuing our commitment on contemporary art, and we will always work with living artists to commission them, to give them a space to exhibit and create a legacy that everyone's very proud of.